Wondering if you could expand on your comment with respect to the effect on public confidence by real or perceived conflict of interest.
Ethics. We got the ethics committee. Lots happening, lots going on. Check it out. Leave your
Your
comments below.
testimony has been very fascinating. I think one of the things that was really striking about this group, is that we realized when we began with Finance Committee, is that the government had really little comprehension about how this organization worked. They knew of We Charity, but basically they knew of Craig and Marc Kielburger because Craig and Marc Kielburger were so closely connected to so many key ministers. They'd invited Minister Qualtrough to one of their big events and feted her. They had the Prime Minister's mother and brother at their events. His wife was working with them. Minister Morneau was closely involved. Minister Chagger was involved. But there was very little due diligence about the actual operation. And I'm wondering about that. And I'm not blaming the civil service, but because there was such a sense of closeness between the Kielburgers and all the key government officials, that it seemed that this was a group that could actually deliver the services, but the questions of their capacity to actually do this were not asked. Do you think that this was one of the problems that got the government into so much trouble with this scandal?
Well, the way you explain it, I would have to say yes. But what is really had been documented would be might be giving us another light on this issue. But I agree with you. We knew a lot about the founders, but we might not have known a lot about the organization itself. And you're right. One of the due diligence that is need to do is not to know about only the people who actually manage a corporation, but about the corporation itself. You want to know the financial structure of the corporation. You want to know the financial stability. In this case, I'm quite sure someone must have documented the decision making and the due diligence process that was done. So I would assume that it was documented. I don't know what came out of it, and if the recommendation that were made, if the due diligence was not done, then that would be very surprising, and that would need to be documented.
I think so. One would assume that these questions would be asked, but in the 5,000 pages of documents, those questions don't seem to have been asked. For example, our committee found out that the board of directors were fired in the middle of the pandemic for asking financial statements, as the Kielburgers were firing hundreds of staff. And my understanding of a charity is the charity board is there to oversee financial propriety. And yet Michelle Douglas told us she had been fired, told to let go. The other board was removed. But none of those questions about their financial capacity was asked in any of the documents the government looked at. They just assumed the We Group under the Kielburgers delivered. Do you think that would be problematic?
That would be questionable for sure. And I do think that it's all about what was the information that was accessible for them at the time of the decision. What was the information that they could have asked to obtain before making the decision? And what was the information that was probably protected under non-disclosure agreements, such as when they were having issues with the board members, now we know why they left, but at the time of the decision, was that information available? Those are the questions that we would normally ask your officials to say, a part of your enhanced due diligence, what did you do and how did you satisfy yourself?
Yes, because we don't see any of those numbers at all. So when the question of capacity comes up, for example, to make this program work, they had to reach 20,000 students, which in the case of a pandemic in a short few months was quite a number. And yet the Kielburgers claimed they could take 10,000 students immediately. And that really reassured the civil service. Personally, I think the idea that you could take 10,000 students in for one charity where they've fired all their staff deserved questions. Can you really do this? Is this possible? But when they were asked about it, they said, well, we have an agreement with Imagine Canada. Imagine Canada turned around and said they did not have an agreement. Imagine Canada were very clear they did not sign up. They thought there were serious problems. And yet months after Imagine Canada made it clear they weren't getting involved, the government was still using the claim that the Kielburgers were working with Imagine Canada and could take 10,000 students. So that due diligence isn't there. And I'm not blaming the civil service. I'm asking if perhaps, as you talked about the bypass routes for certain actors, because of the comfortability with the Kielburger brothers and all the key ministers if the civil service just assumed that things would be okay because, hey, it's Marc and Craig Kielburger.
Agree with you. I think that one of the things, and they might have done it, and maybe it's in the 5,000 pages that you said, ask a letter from the other party to say, are you in agreement, right? Did you enter an agreement right now with the We Charity that you would actually collaborate with them and deliver recruits? This is what would have been normal due diligence to do, to ask, because you see, whenever someone is actually reporting to a checklist, well, you ask for supporting documents to validate it. So that's the first part. The second part, I think, is sometime in corporation, we talk about the risk appetite. You do a risk assessment and you consider what is an acceptable risk and not. So in this situation, would be very curious to see what was the risk assessment of that special project.
That's a really good question. And we don't seem to have that. Now, when the agreement was signed, we were all surprised to find that the agreement was actually set up with a shell company, the We Charity Foundation, which in its document says it was set up to handle real estate. But the Kielburgers had many of these numbered companies, shell companies. And so the federal government were going to deliver over $500 million to a shell company. And the board of directors of that shell company were employees of We. To me, it's extraordinary, but there doesn't seem to have been any questions. Would you feel that that would be a difficult or a questionable corporate structure if we were going to give so much federal dollars through basically a shell company that limits liability to the Kielburgers?
As brief as possible, Mr. Tasse.
Yeah, sure. I would say this would be questionable. You would need to document it, and you would really ask yourself, why did they needed to use those corporate structures?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know about you. It seems really revealing, like pulling back the blankets about what happens in the backside of politics. It is what it is, right? So here we have MP Barrett, and he carries on with the same basic line of questioning as we see at MP Angus. Check it out.
If you could expand on your comment with respect to the effect on public confidence by real or perceived conflict of interest, particularly around the cabinet table. What effect do those conflicts have on Canadians' confidence in their democratic institutions?
I think the major effect results from the fact that what people hear is from the media. And very often the media will report it in a way that will actually put something in favor or against. The problem is that people will make themselves a decision based on what they see in the media. So it's the perception that is worse than sometimes the actual act himself. People have a tendency to always expect the worst to happen. And especially in time of pandemic, people have what we call a anxiety related to performance of any kind of stuff like that. So for them, as soon as they hear something negative, they take it for granted and they expand on it. And I think that's the biggest issue when there is perception. You're not able to really set the facts straight. And we see more and more now that some medias are not really going based on facts. They're mostly based on perception.
So do you believe that during those times of heightened anxiety, especially, and for example, like the pandemic that we're currently living through, that more caution or real or extra due diligence be undertaken to prevent the damage that can come from those decisions?
I would say that the existing procurement system already has some very good internal control in place, and I wouldn't think there would be extra work to be done. But the thing is, if because of emergency, we are bypassing some existing rules and controls that are already in place, then at this time, I agree, we should be extra cautious. Sometimes we have no choice. In order to speed up the process, we might need to accelerate the process. But the thing is, be careful. If you're putting some internal control away, you need to have extra enhanced due diligence in order to make sure that you have other controls to compensate for the one that were not respected.
So with respect to the 16 conditions that you listed, in this case, we've learned through media reports that there would be real questions about a number of those 16 items. And in a situation where there's only one option that's being presented to the decision makers, and with respect to due diligence having been completed by public servants, if there are gaps in terms of the satisfaction or the quality with which the organization that's being considered meets one of those criteria, how effective is that list if there's not an option? If it's simply a yes or no, and if no, well, we're in a pandemic and therefore we're going to fail to deliver to a very large number of Canadians. So it was presented to us as a binary choice, but in that choice, there were quite clearly, if those 16 criteria were checked, as we've seen in very public media reports since, that anyone looking at those conditions would have found a number of serious areas for concern.
Yes, well, I think that those 16 questions are really there to give you a guideline. The thing is, if there is some of them that you say, as you pointed out, when there's only one option on the table, well, you need to ask yourself, why is there only one option on the table, and what was actually put to support it, to document it? And I think it always comes down to those questions. What were the answers, and what was documented in order to support the fact that you might say, you know what, this does not apply because of X, Y, Z reason. But I think that you cannot push those questions away. But on the other hand, you need to find alternative reasoning, such as, is it logic that there is only one supplier that can actually provide me that type of service? Before the pandemic, was there more? How come there's only one right now? Some of them have just gone out of business or are not interested. That could be a possibility, but you need to document and support whatever decision has been made.
So we have a conflict of interest and ethics regime, the Act and the Code, and they're not new. I mean, in a historical context, they're in the history of our country, they are new, but they didn't come into force in 2015 with this government. They were in place with during the previous government's tenure. But we've seen a number of very high profile breaches and findings of breaches by the ethics commissioner. But into our sixth year with this government, we seem to see the same behaviors repeated, and we're told that there's more for folks to learn. Would you not say that it's incumbent on the decision makers, on public office holders, to have an intimate knowledge of the rules and to ensure that they're followed in order to protect Canadians' confidence in their public institutions?
As brief as possible, Mr. Tasse.
Yeah, sure. I would think it is one of the responsibility to know them, to make sure they understand them, to receive the training on them if they don't understand them correctly. And as you pointed out, I think the conflict of interest code for members of the House of Commons was put in 2004, if I recall correctly, and the Conflict of Interest Act in 2007. The thing is, sometimes there is a difference between the code and the act in terms of the requirement. This is something that sometimes might lead to confusion up to a certain level.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Now we'll move on to Mr. Dong for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, colleagues, and Mr. Tasse, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm sure that you have had a chance to review a number of government's emergency assistance programs, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. The government has been clear about the need to balance speed of deployment while building back-end safeguards. On par, would you agree that the government has done well?
It's really hard for me to say so, first of all, because I don't have access to all the information, all the facts that were supported. Unfortunately, the only thing I see right now is from the media, so I don't think it would be fair for me to stipulate on that.
Fair enough. With relation to our study here, we were looking at conflict of interest and lobbying in relation to pandemic spending. For example, buying PPEs for the frontline workers, ventilators for people suffering from worse symptoms of COVID, and even vaccines to inoculate Canadians for the future. Would you say that this spending is bad, that is suffering from pervasive ethical lapses?
Once again, it would be very hard to say. I think the security of people has been put at stake, and I think all the decisions that were made were probably for good reason. It's just was the process followed? It's all about the procurement process. If it was followed or not, this is where the answer lies.
Okay. I wonder what advice would you be willing to provide to the committee about the best kind of due diligence that can happen during emergency decision making? I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 is precisely that type of emergency.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see you again, even though it's only in virtual format. Can you tell the committee how long it usually takes your office to compile and release a report on alleged illegal lobbying?
During our meeting, he is a frequent media commentator and a conference speaker. Has been published extensively in Canada and abroad, quoted in various publications such as the Wall Street Journal, and delivers presentations at the Harvard Institute for Learning Retirement. So, Mr. Tasse, it's great to have you with us today. Please go ahead for 7 minutes with your opening remarks, and then we'll go to our rounds of questions and answers.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, dear Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, in time of global crisis, the worst and best human behaviors are noticeable as a result of the declaration of a state of health emergency, the abolition of certain internal controls procedures for awarding contracts makes the federal government vulnerable to fraud, corruption, embezzlement, undue influence, and most of all, conflict of interest. With the introduction of tens of billions of dollars in new federal aid programs, oversight and accountability are becoming unavoidable paradigms. Thus, alternative measures must be put in place to compensate for the revocation of certain internal compliance control. While rapid action is needed in time of crisis, maintaining an adequate level of due diligence at the supply chain level is essential to prevent corruption, fraud, and other illegal and unethical practices. The reputation of the government and the credibility of the program depends on it. First, let's define a conflict of interest. So a conflict of interest may arise in all environments and sometimes irrespectively of the will of the public official. Every person has private interests. Civil servants, however, have a duty to serve the public interest and to make decisions using criteria in an impartial manner. If not managed appropriately and left unresolved, a conflict of interest can lead to corruption. As seen from the definition above, in situations of conflict of interest, the private capacity interests of the public official may improperly influence the decision-making process. There is three different types of conflict of interest. The first one is what we call the actual, or if you prefer, the real conflict of interest, which involves a situation where the official private capacity interest is already in conflict with his or her duty to perform in the public interest. The second one is a potential or a future conflict of interest, which involves a situation where the official's private capacity interest does not yet come into conflict with his or her duty to perform in the public interest, but may do so in the future. And the third one is an apparent conflict of interest, and that would involve a situation where the official's private capacity interest look as if it is in conflict with his or her duty to perform in the public interest, although this is not the case. So there's three different types of conflict of interest. And how do we deal with that? Well, first of all, a duty is imposed on officials to disclose any conflict of interest and, if directed to do so by their superior or the relevant public sector body, to apply a management strategy such as recusal, removal, or even the resignation from duties to mitigate the risk of corruption or loss of trust. I strongly believe that all laws need teeth to ensure compliance. Whether it is increasing awareness among public office holders of the law and its code, or penalizing those who accept to be lobbied when they know they are dealing with a public service holder without authorization, it must be looked at it in a way to encourage compliance and discourage any inadvertent or willful disregard from the laws and codes of ethics. As I said in my opening remarks, the degree of due diligence should be commensurate with the urgency in which decisions are made because transparency must prevail and is fundamental in maintaining the public trust in our institution. Yes, decision can be made urgently, but we have the mechanism to transparently review those decisions during or after the fact and hold decision makers accountable for those decisions. For sure, mistakes may be made, but the key is to have mechanisms that allow for urgent decision to be made, but not at the long-term cost of the reduction of the public trust or good governance. In public contract, the most basic caution requires a comprehensive justification and documentation of the decision-making process recommendation, recommending the award of a non-tender contract. When it comes to awarding a sole source contract to an entity, it is crucial that some questions are specifically answered as follows. Then I'm going to name you a list of 15. I know it's long, but it's very important. First one, does the entity have impeccable probity? Second one, does the entity have the technical skills? Does the entity have the human resource to carry out the mandate properly? Does the entity have a transparent legal structure? Do the entity have a stable governance structure? Does the entity have the financial stability to complete the contract? Were audit of the entity's officers carried out prior to the award of the contract? Was the contract awarded in an emergency or personal safety context? Were apparent, potential, and actual conflict of interest issue assessed prior to the award of the contract? Is the contract guided by due diligence with respect to the department's interests? Is the contract typical of the relationship between a department and an entity? Does the contract include a clause relating to ongoing monitoring of the ethics and compliance program of the entity that is considered to be retained? Does the contract include anti-corruption clauses? Does the contract contain clauses for the recovery of embezzled funds? And finally, was there a legal validation of the contract prior to its awarding? In conclusion, I think there's a couple of questions that the committee has to ask themselves. Could the vulnerability known at all levels, but particularly in government contracts since the beginning of the pandemic, have been prevented with better pre-pandemic planning? In other words, are the laws that serve as a framework for the proper management of public funds to ensure value for money, the absence of conflict of interest, appropriate lobbying, rules for offer to purchase, and so on, are they suitable for the context of a pandemic or other type of emergency? Another question that the committee should ask itself is, do the administrator of these laws and the status themselves have sufficient resources and teeth to prevent, detect, and punish violation of these laws, and in particular, conflict of interest in emergency condition that requires greater transparency and integrity to maintain Canadian confidence in its institutions? The public has a right to transparency because taxpayer money is spent. The appearance of a conflict of interest is as damaging to public trust as the actual conflict, in my view. Again, in my view, there's a direct relationship between the urgency of decision-making in these pandemic situations and a proportionate and high degree of transparency, oversight, and consequences for violation of those laws. In this time of a global pandemic where wrongdoing can lead to reputationally damaging administrative or judicial action, the government must set an example and strengthen its reputation for integrity. The government and senior officials need to be more vigilant and strengthen structures to reduce the risk of favorism and clientelism in awarding contracts. Although emergency exemption may be permitted to award sole source contract, they must also necessary and be necessary and non-selective as they provide possible bypass route for deviant actors. Canada has an efficient rule-based procurement system. Therefore, the government and senior official just have to use it properly and follow the rules. One last word. Beyond the prevention of fraudulent behavior through laws or norms that are added to an already existing arsenal, it would be wise to also think about ethics and support programs for individuals in position of power in order to anchor a true ethical work culture based on discernment and questioning before making decisions. So thank you very much, and I'm now available to answer any of your questions.
Now they're doing a second round. Basically, if there's any big highlights, we're going to put the video for you. But stay tuned. This is going to carry on, and we're going to learn a lot more of what they have to say. A lot more witnesses in the comments below. Have a good day.